London, December 26, 1815. The Duchess of Somerset's winter ball blazed with 1,000 candles, their light caught and multiplied by mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and the blinding array of diamonds adorning throats and wrists of the assembled company. Outside the tall windows, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, transforming the manicured gardens into a landscape of white shadows and dark branches. Inside, the warmth of human bodies and burning wax created an atmosphere so thick it felt cloying with the mingled scents of expensive perfumes, pomades, and hothouse flowers, a heady, suffocating mix, arranged in towering displays throughout the ballroom. Dorothea Minerva Sutherland stood in her customary position near the marble column closest to the refreshment room, a location that afforded her an excellent view of the proceedings while rendering her essentially invisible to the swirling masses of silk and superfine wool. At 29 years of age, after 6 full seasons without a single proposal of marriage, she had achieved a peculiar sort of freedom that came with complete social irrelevance. No one watched her anymore. No one whispered about her prospects or lack thereof. She had become, quite simply, part of the architectural features of any given ballroom. The irony was not lost on her that this invisibility allowed her to see everything others missed. If stories of truth spoken in darkness and courage, found in unlikely places, move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Tonight, however, Dorothea's usual detachment wavered as she observed the scene unfolding at the center of the ballroom. Julian Garrett Fitzroy, Marquess of Denmore, stood beside Lady Vivian Dalton with the rigid posture of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating a joy. His tall frame, clothed in impeccable evening dress of black superfine with a cravat tied in the intricate mathematical style, seemed carved from the same marble as the columns surrounding the room. His dark, severe hair, distinguished by a few threads of silver at the temples, despite his 33 years, was brushed back from a face that might have been handsome had it ever shown any expression beyond cool reserve. The silent Marquess, society called him, and tonight Dorothea understood why. While his betrothed, the exquisite Lady Vivian, smiled and accepted congratulations with practiced grace, the Marquess himself appeared to be counting the moments until he could be relieved of his tedious duty. His gray eyes, the color of winter storms, swept the room with the assessing gaze of a man who trusted little and expected less. Lady Vivian, by contrast, was everything society deemed perfect in a future marchioness. Her golden hair was dressed in elaborate curls threaded with pearls. Her gown of azure silk clung to a figure that had been the toast of the season, a recipient of sonnets and verses from half the unattached gentlemen in London. Her face, with its delicate features and rosebud mouth, had graced the pages of ladies' magazines as an example of ideal English beauty. She laughed at precisely the right moments, touched the Marquess's arm with exactly the proper degree of familiarity, and managed to convey both modest pleasure in her engagement and appropriate dignity in her new position. A slight strain around her eyes, however, hinted at a deeper disquiet. Dorothea had learned long ago to distrust perfection. The announcement came at 10:30. The Duchess of Somerset herself, resplendent in purple silk and enough rubies to ransom a small country, tapped her fan against a champagne flute until the orchestra fell silent and the assembled guests turned expectant faces toward the raised dais where the orchestra had been playing. "My dear friends," the Duchess began, her voice carrying easily across the hushed ballroom, "it is my very great pleasure to announce that the wedding of the Marquess of Denmore and Lady Vivian Dalton will take place on the 14th of February at St. George's Church in Hanover Square. We shall celebrate love itself on the very day dedicated to such sentiments." Applause rippled through the crowd. Dorothea watched as Lady Vivian's smile widened, her blue eyes sparkling with what appeared to be genuine delight. The Marquess inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression unchanged. Dorothea found herself wondering, not for the first time that evening, what had prompted such a reserved man to propose to such a conspicuously beautiful woman? The match made sense on paper, certainly. Lady Vivian came from an impeccable family, possessed considerable beauty, and had managed 6 seasons without scandal. The Marquess needed an heir, having been widowed 4 years earlier under circumstances that remained, even now, subjects of whispered speculation. Yet something in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Lady Vivian leaned against him, suggested a man who had resigned himself to a fate rather than embraced a future. The orchestra resumed playing. Couples began to form sets for the next dance. Dorothea retreated further into her corner, accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing footman more out of habit than thirst. She had perfected the art of appearing occupied while remaining unobtrusive, a skill developed over years of being neither sought after nor entirely ignored. It was this very invisibility that allowed her to witness what happened next. Lady Vivian, pleading a sudden need for air after the excitement of the announcement, separated herself from the Marquess with a flutter of her fan and a whispered comment that made him frown slightly. She moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a woman accustomed to parting crowds simply by existing within them. Dorothea, positioned near the corridor that led to the conservatory, watched as Lady Vivian glanced around once, twice, ensuring no one of consequence observed her direction, before slipping through a side door that opened onto the snow-covered gardens. Curiosity, that most dangerous of Dorothea's many faults according to her late mother, prompted her to follow at a discreet distance. She told herself she merely sought cooler air, that the crush of the ballroom had become oppressive. She told herself many things that were not entirely true, but allowed her to justify actions she knew perfectly well were motivated by that insatiable need to understand what others overlooked. The corridor was mercifully empty, lit by wall sconces that cast dancing shadows on the wallpaper depicting scenes of pastoral bliss. Dorothea moved quietly, her slippers making barely a whisper against the carpeted floor. The door to the gardens stood slightly ajar, and through it came the muffled sound of voices. She should have turned back. A lady of even moderate propriety would have retreated immediately to the ballroom, would have dismissed whatever intrigue might be unfolding as none of her concern. But Dorothea Minerva Sutherland had never been particularly good at behaving as ladies ought, a failing that had contributed significantly to her current unmarried state. She positioned herself behind a potted palm near the doorway, close enough to hear but concealed enough to remain undetected. The voices became clearer, and what she heard sent a chilling dread through her, despite the warm air of the corridor. "You promised me it would be tonight." The male voice carried an edge of desperation that made Dorothea's skin prickle with unease. She recognized it immediately as belonging to Lord Simon Carrick, third son of the Earl of Westbrook, a man known primarily for his gambling debts and his habit of pursuing wealthy widows with predatory determination. "And it shall be, darling." Lady Vivian's voice, so sweet and melodious in the ballroom, carried an entirely different quality here in the darkness. At 11 o'clock precisely, when everyone is focused on the midnight supper preparations, the garden pavilion as we discussed, no one will notice our absence. "You said that before your engagement was announced." Lord Simon's tone sharpened. "Yet here you are, betrothed to that cold fish of a Marquess, and I am left with nothing but promises." "Oh, Simon." Lady Vivian's laugh was low and intimate. "Do you truly think I intend to spend my life bound to that dreadfully dull man? I need his title and his fortune, nothing more. Once we are wed and I have secured my position, once an heir is born and my place is unassailable, well, accidents happen, do they not? His first wife's death was never fully explained." The words hung in the cold air like poison. Dorothea felt her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might be audible. This was not merely an illicit flirtation or a moment of weakness. This was conspiracy, treachery of the most calculated sort. "And in the meantime," Lord Simon pressed, I have creditors breathing down my neck, Vivienne. I need money now, not promises of accidents years from now. Which is why, my impatient darling, I have been systematically draining his accounts through that clever little system you suggested with the modiste bills and the decorating expenses. He barely glances at the expenditures I submit. By the time we are wed, I shall have secured enough in my own name to keep you comfortable. Now, 11 o'clock. The pavilion. Wear something dark, and for heaven's sake, be discreet. Dorothea heard the rustle of fabric, a low murmur that suggested a kiss, and then footsteps approaching the door. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as Lady Vivienne swept past. Her perfume of roses and jasmine lingered in the air like a freshly delivered accusation. Lord Simon followed moments later, moving in the opposite direction toward the card rooms. For several long moments, Dorothea remained frozen, her mind racing through the implications of what she had overheard. But the Marquess's face rose in her mind, that carefully controlled expression that spoke of wounds not yet healed from losing his first wife under mysterious circumstances. The idea that he might be walking knowingly toward another trap, that his life might be in actual danger, was intolerable. Dorothea sprang to action, possessing an unfortunate inability to remain silent in the face of injustice, even when silence would have served her better. It was this quality that had earned her the reputation for being peculiar, for speaking when she ought to listen, for noticing what others preferred to ignore. It had cost her friendship, social standing, and any hope of a conventional future. Tonight, she realized as she straightened her spine and smoothed her modest gown of dove-gray silk, it might cost her even more. But she could not, would not, suffer an innocent man to walk into a trap she possessed the power to thwart. She made her way back to the ballroom, her mind working through possibilities and discarding them one by one. Approaching the Marquess directly was impossible. He would think her mad, or worse, assume she was one of those desperate spinsters who invented scandals to gain masculine attention. Speaking to the Duchess would result in public humiliation. Writing an anonymous note seemed cowardly and unlikely to be taken seriously. The solution, when it came to her, was audacious and terrifying in equal measure. She would have to whisper the warning in such a way that he could not see her clearly, could not identify her, but would be compelled by the specificity of the information to investigate himself. If she could accomplish that, if she could plant the seed of doubt without revealing her identity, he might witness the betrayal firsthand and act accordingly. The great clock in the entrance hall struck 10:15, 45 minutes until the rendezvous in the garden pavilion. 45 minutes to summon the nerve to approach one of the most powerful men in England and whisper words that would either save him or destroy her utterly. Dorothea positioned herself near the terrace doors, pretending to admire the snow falling beyond the glass while she waited for an opportunity. The Marquess stood near the far wall, conversing with the Duke of Hartwell about something that appeared to involve horse breeding, if the Duke's animated hand gestures were any indication. Lady Vivienne had been absorbed into a cluster of ladies near the refreshment table, her laughter ringing out at intervals like carefully placed musical notes. At 10:30, the Marquess excused himself from the Duke and began moving toward the terrace doors, perhaps seeking the same escape from the oppressive atmosphere that Lady Vivienne had claimed earlier. Dorothea's pulse quickened. This was her moment, her only chance. She moved with deliberate casualness, timing her approach so that she would intercept him near the doorway, where shadows from the heavy velvet curtains would obscure her features. As he reached for the door handle, she stepped close enough that he would hear, but not so close as to be improper, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your bride is meeting another man tonight, at 11 o'clock in the garden pavilion," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Lord Simon Carrick, if you value your life and fortune, observe them yourself. Trust nothing she says." She did not wait for his response. Before he could turn fully to see who had spoken, she melted back into the crowd, her heart hammering, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to still their shaking. Behind her, she heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the weight of his gaze searching the nearby guests for the source of that devastating whisper. But Dorothea had already positioned herself behind a group of matrons discussing the latest on dit about the Duchess of Marlborough's questionable choice in bonnets, rendering herself once again invisible. What she had done was either the bravest or most foolish act of her life. Within the hour, she would know which. Julian's mind, already suspicious from his first wife's death, seized upon the specific location and time, concrete, actionable intelligence that could not be dismissed as mere gossip. The Marquess stood motionless at the terrace doors for several moments, his hand still on the handle, his posture rigid with something that might have been shock or anger or calculation. Then, with deliberate slowness, he released the handle and turned back into the ballroom, his gray eyes scanning the crowd with new intensity. Dorothea forced herself to breathe normally, to sip her lemonade, to nod politely when Mrs. Ashford made some comment about the unseasonably heavy snow. Inside, however, her mind raced with questions and fears. Would he believe her? Would he investigate? And if he did witness the betrayal, would he somehow trace the warning back to her? At 11:15, Lady Vivian made a show of retiring to the ladies' withdrawing room to have her hem repaired after someone had supposedly trod upon it during the last dance. The Marquess, engaged in conversation with Lord Fairfax about parliamentary matters, appeared not to notice her departure. But Dorothea, watching with the attention to detail that had always been both her gift and her curse, saw the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze flickered toward the clock, the minute adjustment of his cravat that suggested a man preparing for action. At 11:10, the Marquess excused himself from Lord Fairfax with a comment about needing to speak with his estate manager who was attending the ball. He moved not toward the card rooms where gentlemen typically conducted business discussions, but toward the same side door through which Lady Vivian had disappeared earlier. Dorothea's hands went cold. He was going to investigate. He would see the truth for himself. Relief warred with a new fear. What would happen when Lord Simon and Lady Vivian were discovered? What scandal would erupt? And would her own involvement somehow be revealed in the chaos that was certain to follow? The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Dorothea remained at her post near the column, every nerve taut with anticipation. Around her, the ball continued its glittering course, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the snow-covered gardens. The orchestra played a lively country dance. Couples whirled past in blurs of color and candlelight. Footmen circulated with trays of champagne and delicate pastries. At precisely 11 o'clock, a commotion erupted from the direction of the gardens. The music faltered, then stopped entirely. Conversations died mid-sentence as all heads turned toward the source of the disturbance. The Marquess of Denmore appeared in the doorway, his evening coat dusted with snow, his expression carved from ice. Behind him, being firmly escorted by two of the Duchess's footmen, came Lady Vivian Dalton and Lord Simon Carrick. Lady Vivian's elaborate coiffure had come partially undone, golden curls escaping their pins. Her azure gown bore suspicious creases that suggested it had been recently and hastily readjusted. Most damning of all, Lord Simon's cravat hung loose around his neck. His coat was missing entirely, and his face bore the unmistakable flush of a man who had been caught in flagrante. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 300 of London's most elite citizens stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, fans arrested mid-flutter, every eye fixed on the tableau unfolding before them. The Duchess of Somerset recovered first, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage as she swept forward, her purple silk rustling like the wings of an avenging angel. "Lord Denmore," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a well-honed blade. "I trust there is an explanation for this unprecedented disruption." "Indeed there is, Your Grace." The Marquess's voice, usually so carefully modulated, now carried an edge that made several nearby ladies visibly flinch. It would appear that my betrothed chose this evening, the very night our wedding date was announced, to conduct an assignation with Lord Simon Carrick in your garden pavilion. I discovered them in circumstances that leave no room for misunderstanding. A palpable wave of shock swept through the assembled company. Lady Vivienne, to her credit, attempted to rally. Her chin lifted, her blue eyes widening with what would have been convincing innocence had anyone not known better. "My lord, I can explain," she began, her voice carrying just the right note of wounded dignity. "This is a dreadful misunderstanding. Lord Simon and I were merely discussing a matter of importance regarding his sister, who is a dear friend. The cold drove us to seek shelter in the pavilion." "Without your police?" The Marquess's question was delivered with devastating calm. "Without a chaperone? With Lord Simon's coat removed and your gown in significant disarray? Madam, I may be called the silent Marquess, but I am not a fool." Lord Simon, recognizing that denial was futile, attempted a different approach. "See here, Denmore," he blustered, drawing himself up with false bravado. "Lady Vivienne and I have an understanding. She was forced into this engagement by her family's financial difficulties. She never wanted to marry you." "An understanding." The Marquess repeated the words as if tasting something bitter. "How remarkably convenient. Tell me, Lord Simon, does this understanding include plans for my eventual demise once the marriage has secured Lady Vivienne's position? Or was that to be a pleasant surprise?" The blood drained from Lady Vivienne's face. Lord Simon's bluster evaporated like morning mist. The ballroom, already silent, somehow became even more so. "I overheard your conversation earlier this evening," the Marquess continued, his grey eyes never leaving Lady Vivienne's face. "Your discussion of accidents and my first wife's death. Your scheme to drain my accounts through fraudulent expenses. I heard everything." It was a necessary lie, of course, for the Marquess had heard nothing until Dorothea's whisper. But in that moment, with the evidence irrefutable, the lie served truth better than truth itself. Lady Vivienne's composure shattered. Her carefully maintained mask of innocence cracked, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "You are mistaken, my lord," she hissed, abandoning all pretense. "You were in the ballroom. This is a fabrication, an attempt to escape your promise." "I assure you, madam, no other woman is required to make me wish to be rid of you. Your own actions accomplish that admirably." The Marquess turned to address the Duchess, and by extension, the entire assembly. "I hereby formally and publicly dissolve my engagement to Lady Vivienne Dalton. Any contract signed may be considered void based on fraud and infidelity. Her family may expect a full accounting of the expenses they have submitted in her name over the past 3 months. I suspect they will find the totals rather enlightening." The Duchess, her face stern as Moses delivering commandments, nodded once. "Lord Simon Carrick, you will remove yourself from my home immediately and consider yourself unwelcome in this house henceforth. Lady Vivienne, your family will be notified of this disgrace. I suggest you retire to the country for an extended period. London, I suspect, will not welcome you for some considerable time." The footman escorted the disgraced pair from the ballroom. Lady Vivienne's parting glance swept the crowd with venomous fury, as if seeking the person responsible for her downfall. Dorothea, still concealed near her column, held perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Then, just as Lady Vivienne was about to disappear through the doorway, her gaze locked onto Dorothea's face. For one terrible, eternal moment, their eyes met. Recognition flared in Lady Vivienne's expression, along with something darker and more dangerous. Dorothea's blood turned to ice. Somehow, Lady Vivienne had deduced her involvement. Perhaps she had seen Dorothea near the corridor earlier. Perhaps her maid had noticed Dorothea following. Or perhaps it was simply the intelligent malice of a cornered predator identifying the weak link in the chain that had trapped her. Whatever the reason, Dorothea knew with absolute certainty that Lady Vivienne Dalton, even in disgrace, would not rest until she had exacted revenge. The ballroom remained in chaos for some minutes after the door closed behind the disgraced pair. Conversation erupted like a dam breaking, hundreds of voices rising in excited speculation, scandal, and not a little satisfaction that they had witnessed such a dramatic event firsthand. The Duchess called for the orchestra to resume playing, attempting to restore some semblance of normalcy to an evening that would be discussed in drawing rooms across London for months to come. The Marquess remained near the center of the room, accepting condolences and congratulations from a parade of well-wishers with the same cool reserve he had displayed throughout the evening. If he was shaken by the revelation of his betrothed's betrayal, he gave no sign. His face remained impassive, his posture correct, his responses brief and courteous. But Dorothea, watching him with that peculiar intensity she brought to all her observations, detected something in the set of his mouth, the slight tightness around his eyes. This was a man who had been wounded and was now building walls even higher than those he had maintained before. She should have been relieved. The warning had been delivered, the betrayal exposed, the innocent man saved from a calculated trap. Her involvement remained unknown to all but Lady Vivian, who was now powerless and disgraced. Dorothea could return to her invisible existence, secure in the knowledge that she had done the right thing. Yet something in the Marquess's expression troubled her. He had been saved, yes, but at what cost? His trust, already damaged by his first wife's mysterious death, had been shattered again. He had been on the verge of marrying a woman who planned his murder. How did one recover from such a betrayal? She was still pondering this question when a footman approached her, offering a silver tray upon which rested a folded note sealed with unmarked wax. "A message for Miss Sutherland," the footman said quietly, bowing slightly. Dorothea's hands trembled as she accepted the note. Who could be writing to her? And why now, at this particular moment? She broke the seal with fingers that suddenly felt numb. The message was brief and written in a firm, masculine hand. "The garden terrace in 15 minutes. I would speak with the woman who saved my life. If you value discretion, come alone. D." The signature was simply the letter D, but Dorothea knew with absolute certainty who had sent it. The Marquess of Denmore had somehow identified her as his mysterious informant. A tremor, part dread and part exhilaration, ran through her veins. She had 15 minutes to decide whether to meet him or to flee the ball entirely and hope that he would accept her absence as a refusal. The sensible choice was obvious. Meeting him alone would invite scandal. Speaking with him would only confirm what he apparently already suspected. She should burn the note and leave immediately. Instead, she found herself moving toward the terrace doors. The air outside was bitterly cold, the snow still falling in thick flakes that caught the light from the ballroom windows and glittered like scattered diamonds. Dorothea pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and stepped onto the terrace, grateful for the shadows provided by the overhanging eaves. She did not have long to wait. Within moments, the Marquess emerged from the ballroom, closing the glass doors behind him with careful precision. He moved to where she stood, his height and broad shoulders making her acutely aware of how small and insignificant she was in comparison. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying her face with those penetrating gray eyes. Dorothea forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show the fear that made her pulse fluttered with the force of a desperate wing-beat. "Miss Dorothea Sutherland," he said finally, his voice low and carefully neutral. "Daughter of the late Viscount Sutherland. 29 years of age, 6 seasons without a single offer of marriage. Known in certain circles as peculiar, outspoken, and possessed of an unfortunate habit of noticing details that others prefer to ignore. You have been admirably diligent in your pursuit of particulars, my lord." Dorothea was pleased to hear that her voice remained steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "I assume you did not invite me here merely to recite my failures and eccentricities." On the contrary, something that might have been amusement flickered in his expression. Those so-called failures and eccentricities are precisely the reasons I desired this meeting. You were the one who whispered the warning. Do not bother to deny it. I made inquiries immediately after the incident. You were observed near the corridor leading to the gardens around the time Lady Vivian made her earlier excursion. Several servants recalled seeing you linger near the doorway, and you were positioned near me when the warning was delivered. And if I was? Dorothea lifted her chin, matching his directness with her own. What of it? I assume you did not summon me here to express gratitude. Men of your station rarely acknowledge debts to women like me. Women like you. He repeated the phrase thoughtfully. You mean women who speak truth regardless of consequences? Women who possess courage that most men lack? Women who would risk their own reputation to warn a stranger of danger? I mean women who have no consequence, my lord. I have no prospects, no fortune to mitigate the social cost of my frankness. What is one more scandal added to a list of disappointments? You heard them planning my death. It was not a question. Lady Vivian and Lord Simon, you overheard their conspiracy. I heard enough to know that you were in genuine danger, Dorothea confirmed. I heard her speak of accidents and your first wife's death. I heard him demand money and her promise to drain your accounts. I heard them arrange their assignation. What I did not hear was any indication that either possessed a shred of genuine human feeling. The Marquess was silent for several moments, his gaze fixed on the falling snow. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality she had not heard before, something raw and unguarded. My first wife died falling from a horse, he said quietly. The inquest ruled it an accident, but there were questions. The girth had been tampered with. No one could prove anything, but the suspicion remained. Tonight, hearing Lady Vivian reference that death so casually, as if planning my own demise based on the success of a previous murder, and realizing that the isolation and distrust caused by that tragedy were about to cost me my life. He stopped, his jaw tightening. You saved my life, Miss Sutherland. How does one adequately thank someone for such a service? One does not, Dorothea replied simply. I did not act expecting gratitude or reward. I acted because allowing an innocent person to be harmed when I possessed the power to prevent it would have been intolerable. You owe me nothing, my lord. Indeed, I would prefer that we never speak of this again. I have no wish to be drawn into the scandal that will certainly follow tonight's events. Too late for that, I fear. The Marquess's expression turned grim. Lady Vivian looked directly at you before she was escorted out. She knows, or suspects, your involvement. A woman like that does not forgive such interference in her schemes. Dorothea had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the December cold. I suppose I shall deal with whatever retribution she devises. As I said, I have little enough to lose. Do you truly believe that? The Marquess studied her face with disconcerting intensity. You may have no fortune or prospects by society's shallow measures, Miss Sutherland, but you possess something far rarer and more valuable. Integrity, courage, the ability to see what others cannot or will not acknowledge. Those qualities are worth protecting. How kind of you to say so, my lord. Dorothea could not quite keep the bitterness from her voice. Yet I notice that possession of such qualities has not exactly resulted in my social success. Perhaps you have been presenting yourself to the wrong audience. The Marquess's response was immediate and surprising. Or perhaps society is too foolish to recognize value when it stands before them. Before Dorothea could formulate a response to this unexpected compliment, the sound of approaching voices from inside made them both turn toward the ballroom doors. The Marquess's expression shifted back to its customary reserve. We should not be seen together, he said quietly. Not yet, but I would very much like to continue this conversation, Miss Sutherland. With your permission, I will call upon you tomorrow afternoon. I am certain there is a great deal we must settle between us. My lord, that would be most improper, Dorothea protested, even as something in her chest tightened at the prospect. You have just publicly ended your engagement amid enormous scandal. Calling upon an unmarried woman the very next day would provoke precisely the sort of speculation that neither of us needs. Let them speculate. The Marquess's tone carried a note of something that might have been reckless determination. I have spent 4 years being careful, being proper, trying to do what was expected of me. It nearly cost me my life. Perhaps it is time I stopped caring quite so much about what society thinks is appropriate and started pursuing what I believe is valuable. With that cryptic statement, he bowed formally and retreated into the ballroom, leaving Dorothea standing alone on the terrace with snowflakes catching in her hair and her mind spinning with questions she had no way to answer. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did the Marquess of Denmore mean when he spoke of pursuing what he believed was valuable? Surely he could not mean her. That would be absurd, impossible. Men like him did not develop sudden interests in women like her, not after mere moments of conversation on a cold terrace. Yet something in his eyes, in the way he had looked at her when he spoke of integrity and courage, suggested possibilities that Dorothea hardly dared to consider. She remained on the terrace for several more minutes, allowing the cold air to clear her head before returning to the ballroom. By the time she re-entered, the scandal of the evening had been thoroughly dissected, reassembled, and was being passed through the room like a particularly delicious morsel at a feast. The Marquess had apparently departed, citing exhaustion after the evening's events. Lady Vivian's family had been located and informed. Lord Simon had been seen leaving London entirely, heading north in a hired carriage. Dorothea collected her cloak and requested her father's carriage, suddenly desperate to escape the noise and speculation. As she waited in the entrance hall, she became aware of someone watching her. She turned to find herself facing a woman she recognized as Lady Agatha Hartwell, the Duke of Hartwell's elder sister, known for her sharp wit and sharper observations. "Miss Sutherland," Lady Agatha said, her grey eyes assessing. "I wonder if I might have a word." Dorothea's heart sank. Had someone observed her conversation with the Marquess after all? Was she about to be warned away from presuming above her station? But Lady Agatha's expression held something other than censure. Indeed, if Dorothea was not mistaken, there was a glint of approval in those intelligent eyes. "I have known Julian Fitzroy since he was a boy," Lady Agatha said quietly, positioning herself so that their conversation could not be overheard by the footman stationed nearby. "He is a good man, though life has taught him to trust sparingly. What happened to his first wife devastated him in ways that few understood. He withdrew from society, from friendship, from everything except his duties. The announcement of his engagement to Lady Vivian troubled me greatly. She was too perfect, too accomplished. I have learned to be suspicious of perfection." "My lady, I am not certain why you are telling me this," Dorothea ventured, confused by the direction of the conversation. "Because I observed you tonight, Miss Sutherland. I have a habit of watching people much as you do. I saw you near that corridor. I saw you position yourself near the Marquess at precisely the right moment. And I saw his face after whatever you whispered to him. You saved him from a terrible fate, did you not?" There seemed little point in denying it to this shrewd woman. Dorothea inclined her head in acknowledgement. "I thought as much." Lady Agatha's expression warmed. "Then you should know that Julian Fitzroy is not a man who forgets debts. More importantly, he is not a man who wastes his regard on unworthy objects. If he has taken an interest in you, and I suspect he has based on the way he looked at you before he left, then you should take that interest seriously. He does not bestow his attention lightly. With respect, my lady, I am hardly the sort of woman who attracts the attention of marquesses," Dorothea replied, unable to keep the note of self-deprecation from her voice. "I am 29 years old, without fortune or beauty, and possessed of a reputation for peculiarity that has ensured my permanent spinsterhood." "My dear girl," Lady Agatha's tone was both amused and exasperated, "you saved his life tonight. Do you truly think he evaluates your worth by the same shallow criteria as the rest of society? Julian Fitzroy values intelligence, courage, and integrity above all else. You have demonstrated all three. The question is whether you possess the courage to see where this might lead, or whether you will allow society's foolish judgments to convince you that you deserve nothing better than the shadows you have inhabited for far too long. Before Dorothea could respond, a footman announced that her carriage had arrived. Lady Agatha patted her hand gently. Think about what I have said, and when he calls tomorrow, which I am quite certain he will, do not turn him away out of some misguided belief that you are unworthy of his regard. That, I assure you, would be the greatest error of all. With that cryptic advice, Lady Agatha swept away, leaving Dorothea to make her way to the waiting carriage, with her mind in greater turmoil than it had been all evening. The ride home through snow-covered streets gave her time to process the extraordinary events of the night. She had gone to the ball expecting nothing more than her usual evening of observation and invisibility. She had ended it having exposed a conspiracy, prevented a murder, possibly made a powerful enemy in Lady Vivian, and somehow attracted the notice of one of the most eligible men in England. It was too much to comprehend, too unlikely to be real. Yet the memory of the Marquess's grey eyes studying her face with such intensity, the way he had spoken of integrity and courage, the promise to call tomorrow, all of it felt undeniably real. Dorothea's modest townhouse in Russell Square stood dark and silent, her father having retired hours earlier. She climbed the stairs to her chamber, where her elderly maid helped her remove the dove-grey gown that had witnessed such extraordinary events. As she prepared for bed, Dorothea found herself moving to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street below. Somewhere across London, the Marquess of Denmore was presumably doing the same, perhaps pondering the narrowness of his escape, perhaps considering the woman who had whispered that crucial warning. Dorothea pressed her hand against the cold glass and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future different from the one she had resigned herself to accepting. Then she firmly pushed such thoughts aside. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. For tonight, it was enough to know that she had done what was right, regardless of the consequences. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of grey eyes and falling snow, of whispered warnings and possibilities too fragile to examine too closely in the harsh light of day. The following morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. The previous night's snow blanketing London in pristine white that would soon be transformed to grey slush by thousands of passing feet and carriages. Dorothea woke later than usual, her rest having been disrupted by disturbing dreams she could not quite remember upon waking. She descended to the breakfast room to find her father, Viscount Sutherland, already seated with his newspaper and coffee. "Good morning, my dear," he said absently, not looking up from his reading. "I trust the ball was bearable?" Viscount Sutherland was a kind but vague man who had retreated into his books and newspapers following his wife's death 7 years earlier. He was aware in a general sense that Dorothea attended social events, but he rarely inquired into specifics, assuming that she would inform him of anything requiring his attention. "It was eventful," Dorothea replied carefully, helping herself to toast and tea. "There was a scandal involving Lady Vivian Dalton and the Marquess of Denmore." That caught her father's attention. He lowered his newspaper, his faded blue eyes focusing on her face with more awareness than she had seen from him in months. "Scandal? What sort of scandal?" Dorothea provided a carefully edited version of the evening's events, omitting any mention of her own involvement. Her father listened with increasing dismay, shaking his head at the account of Lady Vivian's betrayal. "Shocking business," he muttered. "Poor Denmore. First his wife's death, now this. The man is cursed with ill fortune in his choice of wife. Well, well, society will be talking of nothing else for weeks, I imagine." "I imagine so," Dorothea agreed, relieved that her father's disinterest in social gossip meant he would not probe deeper into her knowledge of events. They finished breakfast in companionable silence. Dorothea was just contemplating retiring to the library to read when their butler, Henderson, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely suppressed excitement. "Excuse me, Miss Sutherland, but the Marquess of Denmore has called and wishes to know if you are at home to visitors." The teacup Dorothea had been raising to her lips stopped halfway. Her father's newspaper rustled as he lowered it again, his expression now one of complete bewilderment. "The Marquess of Denmore?" he repeated. "Here? To call upon Dorothea?" "So it would appear, my lord," Henderson replied, his tone suggesting that he found this development as unlikely as the Viscount did. "Well?" Her father blinked several times, as if trying to reconcile this information with his understanding of reality. "I suppose you had better show him to the drawing-room, Henderson. Dorothea, you should. Well, you should receive him, I suppose. Though why on earth the Marquess would be calling here I cannot fathom." Dorothea's heart hammered as she sprang from the table, her hands suddenly unsteady. He had come. Despite her protests, despite the impropriety, despite every reason why he should not, the Marquess of Denmore had called upon her the very morning after the scandal. She had perhaps 10 minutes to make herself presentable before Henderson would show the Marquess to the drawing-room. She hurried to her chamber, checked her appearance in the mirror, tucked a few errant strands of dark hair back into their pins, and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. The morning gown she wore was perfectly respectable, a deep green wool that was several years old but still serviceable. It would have to do. By the time she descended to the drawing-room, her composure had been mostly restored, though her pulse still fluttered nervously. She entered to find the Marquess standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden. He turned as she entered, and once again she was struck by his height and the intensity of those gray eyes. "Miss Sutherland," he said, bowing formally. "Thank you for receiving me. I realize my call is somewhat precipitous given last night's events." "Somewhat precipitous," Dorothea repeated, unable to suppress a slight smile at the understatement. "My lord, your former betrothed was exposed as an adulteress and conspirator approximately 14 hours ago. Your calling upon an unmarried lady this morning will certainly be the subject of every drawing-room conversation this season." "Let them wag," he replied, moving away from the window. "I have spent 4 years being careful about wagging tongues. It has not served me well. Won't you sit down?" Dorothea gestured to the chairs arranged near the fireplace, grateful for the protocols that gave structure to what might otherwise be an impossibly awkward encounter. They sat, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. The Marquess seemed to be choosing his words carefully, a habit that Dorothea was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I came," he said finally, "because I wanted to thank you properly for what you did last night." A whispered warning on a crowded terrace seemed insufficient acknowledgement for saving a man's life. "As I told you last night, no thanks are necessary," Dorothea replied. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Would they?" The Marquess's expression was skeptical. "I suspect most people would have convinced themselves it was none of their concern, or feared the social consequences of involvement, or doubted whether anyone would believe them. You did none of those things. You acted immediately and courageously, at considerable risk to yourself." "At no risk whatsoever," Dorothea countered. "I am nobody, my lord. I have no reputation that could be damaged, no prospects that could be ruined. I could afford to take the risk precisely because I have nothing to lose." The Marquess leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes intent on her face. "Do you truly believe that? That you are nobody? That you have nothing of value?" The question pricked Dorothea, probing truths she preferred to leave undisturbed. "I believe that society has made its judgment of me quite clear," she said quietly. 6 seasons without a single offer of marriage. I am neither beautiful enough to overlook my faults, nor rich enough to compensate for them. I am peculiar, outspoken, and possessed of an unfortunate habit of noticing things I ought to ignore. These are not qualities that recommend a woman to prospective husbands. They are precisely the qualities, the Marquess said slowly, that I have come to value above all others. Dorothea's breath caught. Surely he could not mean what his words seemed to imply. My lord, I do not understand. Do you not? He stood, moving to look out the window again, as if the garden beyond held answers he sought. Let me be plain, Miss Sutherland. I have spent 4 years in mourning, not just for my wife, but for the ability to trust. Her death under suspicious circumstances taught me that people are rarely what they seem. I withdrew from society, built walls around my heart, and determined to fulfill my duty to produce an heir through a marriage that required nothing of me emotionally. Lady Vivian seemed perfect for that purpose, beautiful, accomplished, appropriate. I felt no passion for her. I harbored no particular affection. But she was suitable, and I thought that would be enough. He turned back to face her, and Dorothea saw something in his expression that made her heart ache. You showed me in a single night, in a single whispered warning, that I was wrong about everything. Wrong about what matters, wrong about what I should value, wrong about the kind of person I want beside me for the rest of my life. My lord, Dorothea whispered, hardly daring to breathe. What are you saying? I am saying, the Marquess replied, crossing the room to stand before her chair, that I would like permission to court you, Miss Dorothea Sutherland, properly, honestly, with the intention of discovering whether what I suspect might be true. What you suspect? Dorothea could barely form words, her mind reeling from the impossibility of what she was hearing. That you are precisely the woman I should have been looking for all along, intelligent, courageous, honest to a fault, possessed of an ability to see truth where others see only facades. I know this is sudden. I know I have no right to ask this of you after one conversation and one extraordinary act of bravery. But I also know that I would regret it for the rest of my life if I did not at least try to discover whether this feeling, this certainty that I have found something rare and valuable, is as real as it seems. Dorothea stared at him, unable to process the words he was speaking. Men like the Marquess of Denmore did not court women like her. They did not speak of finding something rare and valuable when looking at spinsters of 29 with reputations for peculiarity. This could not be real. You do not know me, she said finally, grasping at the most obvious objection. We have spoken twice. We have shared perhaps 30 minutes of conversation total. You cannot make such a decision based on so little acquaintance. Can I not? The Marquess's expression was wry. I was prepared to marry Lady Vivian after far less substantial knowledge of her character. At least with you, I know the most important thing. That when faced with a choice between convenience and conscience, you choose conscience. That is more valuable than months of superficial acquaintance could reveal. But I have no consequence, my lord. You are a Marquess. You could choose a bride who is wealthy or beautiful, or both. Why would you possibly wish to court someone like me? The Marquess dropped to one knee beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. The gesture was so unexpected, so improper, that Dorothea gasped. Because, he said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity, in all my years among society's beautiful and accomplished women, I have never met one who possessed half your courage or integrity, because you saved my life when you had no reason to care whether I lived or died. Because in the space of one whispered warning, you showed me what genuine character looks like, and because when I look at you, I do not see a nobody. I see a woman of extraordinary value who has somehow been convinced that she is worthless. If you will allow me, I would very much like to prove to you how wrong that belief is. Tears stung Dorothea's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her with such conviction, such certainty of her worth. All her life, she had been made to feel that she was less than, inadequate, a disappointment. And now this man, this reserved and careful Marquess, was kneeling beside her chair and speaking as if she were precious. I do not know how to respond, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is all so sudden, so unexpected. I never imagined that warning you would lead to this." "Neither did I," the Marquess admitted, rising and returning to his chair. "But I have learned that the most important moments in life often come when we least expect them. The question is whether we have the courage to seize them or the cowardice to let them pass." Dorothea took a shaky breath, trying to organize her whirling thoughts. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to grasp this impossible opportunity with both hands. But another part, the cautious part, shaped by years of disappointment, whispered warnings. "My lord," she said carefully, "I am honored by your proposal to court me. Truly. But I must ask you to consider carefully what you are suggesting. The scandal surrounding your broken engagement is just beginning. To be seen courting another woman so soon will invite gossip and speculation. More importantly, you are in a vulnerable emotional state after last night's betrayal. Are you certain that what you feel is genuine interest rather than gratitude, misinterpreted as something more?" The Marquess studied her face for a long moment before responding. "That is a fair question," he acknowledged. "And it shows precisely the kind of thoughtful concern that confirms my initial impression of you. You are right that the timing is complicated. You are right that my emotions are unsettled. But I am also 8 and 30 years old, Miss Sutherland. I have had considerable experience in distinguishing between gratitude and genuine interest. What I feel when I look at you is not obligation or misplaced thankfulness. It is curiosity, admiration, and a powerful desire to know you better. Is that not what courtship is meant to explore?" Put that way, Dorothea found it difficult to argue. "What would such a courtship look like?" she asked cautiously. "Given the circumstances?" "Cautious at first," the Marquess replied. "I have no wish to subject you to vicious gossip. I thought perhaps I might begin by calling upon you regularly, taking tea, conversation. We might attend some quieter social events together with appropriate chaperonage. As the immediate scandal surrounding Lady Vivian fades, we could be more public in our acquaintance. Unless—" he paused, his expression becoming uncertain. "Unless you would prefer not to be associated with me, given the notoriety that will surely attach to my name for some time." "That is not my concern," Dorothea said quickly. "If I worried about notoriety and gossip, I would not have warned you in the first place. I simply want to be certain that we are both entering this with clear understanding and honest intentions." "Then I will be entirely honest with you." The Marquess leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "I do not know if this courtship will lead to marriage. I do not know if what I feel now will deepen or prove to be temporary. But I know that I would regret it immensely if I did not explore the possibility. You intrigue me, Miss Sutherland. You fascinate me. And yes, you saved my life. But more than that, you showed me a quality of character I thought no longer existed. That is worth pursuing, worth discovering, if it might form the foundation of something real and lasting." Dorothea found herself smiling, despite the tumult of emotions swirling through her chest. "Very well, my lord. I accept your proposal to court me. On one condition." "Name it." "That we maintain absolute honesty with each other throughout. If at any point you discover that your interest was indeed temporary, you must tell me immediately. I would rather have my heart broken quickly by truth than slowly by polite pretense." The Marquess's answering smile was the first genuine one she had seen from him, transforming his stern features into something almost handsome. "I agree to your condition, and I would ask the same of you. If you find that I do not meet your expectations, that I am too reserved or too damaged by past hurts, you must tell me." "Agreed," Dorothea said, extending her hand. He took it, his grip warm and firm even through their gloves, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, acknowledging the strangeness and possibility of what had just been decided. The tea soon arrived, followed by a bemused Viscount Sutherland, and the conversation flowed pleasantly. The Marquess showed himself to be an engaging conversationalist when the topic turned to books and history, subjects that interested both Dorothea and her father. By the time he took his leave an hour later, the Viscount was nodding thoughtfully, his expression suggesting that he found the Marquess's attention to his daughter puzzling, but not entirely objectionable. "Well," the Viscount said after the Marquess had departed, "that was unexpected." The man seemed sound enough, despite his recent difficulties. "Dorothea, you will tell me if his attentions become unwelcome?" "I will, Papa," Dorothea assured him, touched by this rare display of paternal concern. "Good, good. Now I believe I shall retire to my study. This business of Marquess's calling has quite disrupted my morning routine." Left alone, Dorothea moved to the window, watching the Marquess's elegant carriage pull away through the snowy streets. Her life, which had seemed utterly mapped just 24 hours earlier, had suddenly become unpredictable and thrilling. She had no idea what would come next, but for the first time in many years, she found herself looking forward to discovering it. The following 3 days unfolded in a flurry of activity that transformed Dorothea's previously quiet existence into something resembling a social whirlwind. The Marquess called each afternoon, always proper, always correct, but with an intensity of attention that made their conversations feel charged with significance. They discussed books and politics, history and philosophy, discovering a compatibility of mind that surprised them both. But beneath the surface of these pleasant calls, darker currents stirred. Word of the Marquess's broken engagement had spread through London like wildfire, and with it came speculation about his subsequent behavior. His attentions to Dorothea Sutherland had been noted, commented upon, analyzed from every possible angle. Some saw it as evidence of the Marquess's questionable judgment, seeking consolation so quickly after such a scandal. Others, more charitably, suggested that perhaps Miss Sutherland had somehow been instrumental in exposing Lady Vivian's perfidy, and the Marquess was simply expressing gratitude. The more malicious whispers suggested that the Marquess and Miss Sutherland had been conducting an affair all along, that their connection had prompted Lady Vivian's betrayal, that the entire situation was far more sordid than it appeared. Dorothea heard these whispers second-hand from her few remaining friends and tried to ignore them. She had expected gossip. What she had not anticipated was the speed with which Lady Vivian would strike back. The blow came 3 days after the ball, at a musical evening hosted by Mrs. Gwendolen Ashcroft in her townhouse in Grosvenor Square. Dorothea had been reluctant to attend, but the Marquess had specifically requested that they make a joint appearance, arguing that facing society together would demonstrate that they had nothing to hide. He had been wrong. The evening began pleasantly enough. Dorothea wore her best gown, a deep burgundy silk that had been her mother's and which she had carefully altered to fit. The Marquess arrived precisely on time to collect her and her father, his manner attentive and courteous. At the musicale, they took seats together near the back of the drawing room, acknowledging greetings from acquaintances with polite nods. The first sign of trouble came when Lady Vivian's cousin, Miss Arabella Whitley, arrived late with a small group of friends. Dorothea had known Arabella slightly during her first few seasons, when they had occasionally found themselves in the same social circles. But Arabella had married well in her second season and had since moved in far more elevated circles than Dorothea could access. Arabella's eyes found Dorothea immediately, and something in her expression made Dorothea's stomach clench with apprehension. She watched as Arabella whispered to her companions, saw them glance in her direction with expressions of shock and avid curiosity. The Marquess, seated beside her, noticed as well. His posture stiffened slightly, his hand moving almost unconsciously to rest on the arm of her chair in a protective gesture. The musical program began with a young lady performing an adequate but uninspired piece on the pianoforte. During the polite applause that followed, Arabella rose from her seat and approached Mrs. Ashcroft, speaking urgently into their hostess's ear. Mrs. Ashcroft's expression shifted from puzzlement to shock, to something that looked uncomfortably like vindictive satisfaction. When the next performer had finished, Mrs. Ashcroft stood and addressed the assembled company. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the drawing room, "before we continue with our musical program, I feel compelled to address a matter that has come to my attention. It concerns the integrity of our gathering and the reputation of those present." A hush fell over the room. Dorothea felt the Marquess tense beside her, his hand now gripping the arm of her chair with visible force. "It has been brought to my attention," Mrs. Ashcroft continued, her gaze fixed pointedly on Dorothea, "that one among us has been less than honest about her character and motivations, that someone has deliberately inserted herself into situations where she does not belong, spreading falsehoods and manipulating circumstances for her own advancement." Dorothea's heart began to pound. This was it. Whatever revenge Lady Vivian had planned, it was about to unfold. Arabella stood, producing a folded letter from her reticule with theatrical precision. "I have here," she announced, "a letter written by Miss Dorothea Sutherland to the Marquess of Denmore. It was written 3 months ago, long before his engagement to my poor cousin was announced. In it, Miss Sutherland declares her passionate feelings for the Marquess and begs him to notice her. When her advances were ignored, she sought revenge by inventing lies about my cousin's character." The room erupted in gasps and excited murmurs. Dorothea felt the blood drain from her face. A letter? She had written no such thing. This was fabrication, pure and simple. "That is impossible," she said, rising from her chair, her voice carrying despite the trembling in her limbs. "I have never written such a letter. I had never even met the Marquess until 3 nights ago." "Really?" Arabella's smile was cruel. "Then perhaps you can explain why this letter bears your handwriting and signature? Why it describes in detail your long admiration from afar and your belief that the Marquess is wasting himself on women who cannot appreciate his true worth?" She held up the letter, allowing those nearby to glimpse what appeared to be Dorothea's handwriting. Dorothea's mind raced. She had written no such thing. But she had a terrible suspicion about who might have access to samples of her handwriting and the skill to forge such a document. "May I see that letter?" The Marquess's voice cut through the rising chatter like a blade. He stood, his height and bearing commanding immediate silence. Arabella hesitated, then handed the letter to Mrs. Ashcroft, who passed it to the Marquess with an expression of scandalized excitement. He read the document in absolute silence, his face revealing nothing. Then, with deliberate care, he folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. "This letter," he said quietly, "is a forgery." "My lord, you cannot possibly know that," Mrs. Ashcroft protested. "The handwriting appears quite genuine." "I know it is a forgery," the Marquess continued, his voice gaining strength, "because I know exactly when and how Miss Sutherland and I first met. I know the nature of our acquaintance. And I know with absolute certainty that she possesses too much integrity to write such a letter, even if she had felt such sentiments." "But the handwriting," Arabella insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. "Multiple people can attest that it matches Miss Sutherland's hand." "Handwriting can be copied," the Marquess replied. "Words can be fabricated, but character cannot be falsified. I have had the privilege of coming to know Miss Sutherland over these past 3 days. She is honest to a fault, courageous beyond measure, and entirely incapable of the sort of manipulation this letter suggests. If anyone here believes otherwise, I invite them to say so directly to my face." The challenge hung in the air. No one spoke. The Marquess's reputation, his title, his sheer presence, were enough to silence even the most determined gossips. But Arabella, pushed too far to retreat gracefully, made one final attempt. "She destroyed my cousin's engagement," she said shrilly. "She whispered lies to you about Lady Vivian, turned you against her with malicious fabrications. Vivian told me everything before she left London. How Miss Sutherland had been watching her jealously all season, how she saw an opportunity to ruin her when you announced your engagement. Lady Vivian," the Marquess said with devastating calm, "was discovered in a compromising position with Lord Simon Carrick. That is fact, not fabrication. Multiple witnesses can attest to it, including the Duchess of Somerset herself. As for Miss Sutherland's role in that discovery, she acted with courage and integrity to warn me of a genuine threat. For that, I am in her debt. He turned to address the entire room, his gray eyes hard as stone. I understand that society thrives on speculation and scandal. I understand that my broken engagement has provided ample material for gossip, but I will not stand by while a woman of genuine character is maligned by those seeking to protect someone whose actions were indefensible. Miss Sutherland did nothing wrong. She acted with courage when most would have remained silent. If anyone here wishes to cut her socially or spread further lies about her character, they should be aware that they will be cutting me as well. The declaration sent another ripple of shock through the assembly. This was unprecedented. A Marquess publicly defending a woman of modest means and no particular social standing. Moreover, doing so in a manner that linked their reputations irrevocably. Mrs. Ashcroft, realizing that her evening had gone horribly awry, attempted to salvage the situation. "Perhaps," she said weakly, "there has been some misunderstanding. Let us return to our musical program and speak no more of this unpleasantness." But the Marquess was not finished. He turned to Dorothea, who stood frozen beside her chair, her face pale but composed. He extended his hand to her. "Miss Sutherland, would you do me the honor of accompanying me outside for a moment? I believe we both could use some air after this display." Dorothea placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip even through their gloves. Together, they walked through the silent, staring crowd toward the door. As they passed Arabella, the Marquess paused. "I suggest," he said quietly, "that you inform Lady Vivian that any further attempts to harm Miss Sutherland will be met with consequences she will not enjoy. I have been patient with your cousin's disgrace, allowing her to retreat quietly to the country. Do not make me reconsider that courtesy." In the entrance hall, as a footman retrieved their coats, the Marquess finally released Dorothea's hand. She was shaking, reaction setting in now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I never intended for you to be dragged further into scandal. That letter, I swear to you, I never wrote such a thing." "I know you did not." The Marquess helped her into her cloak, his movements gentle despite the anger still evident in his rigid posture. "The forgery was obvious to anyone who knows you. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people are all too willing to believe the worst." Outside, the cold December air was a shock after the overheated drawing room. The Marquess handed Dorothea into his carriage, then joined her, giving instructions to his driver to take them to Russell Square. For several moments, they sat in silence as the carriage moved through the darkened streets. Then the Marquess spoke, his voice low and intense. "What I said in there was not merely for show, Miss Sutherland. I meant every word. Your character is beyond reproach. The attempt to blacken your reputation with a forged letter was despicable, and I will not allow it to succeed." "But you defended me so publicly," Dorothea protested. "You linked your name to mine in a manner that will have consequences. People will assume. They will speculate." "Let them." The Marquess turned to face her fully in the dim interior of the carriage. "Miss Sutherland, Dorothea. May I call you Dorothea?" She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Dorothea," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her heart skip. "I defended you tonight because everything I said was true. But I also defended you because I realized, standing in that drawing room listening to those lies, that I could not bear the thought of you being hurt by anyone. That the very idea of you suffering because of your association with me was intolerable." "My lord," Dorothea whispered. "Julian, what are you saying?" "I am saying," he replied, taking her hands in his, "that 3 days is too short a time to know with certainty what will last a lifetime. But it is long enough to know what I do not want to live without. Your courage, your honesty, the way you see the world with such clear-eyed integrity, the way you make me believe that trust might be possible again." He paused, and in the darkness of the carriage, she could just make out the intensity of his expression. "I am saying," he continued, "that I would very much like to stop courting you and start planning to marry you instead, if you will have me. If you can tolerate a man who is too reserved, too damaged by past hurts, too accustomed to suspecting the worst. I cannot promise to be easy to live with, but I can promise to value you, to protect you, to honor the courage it took to save a stranger's life. Will you marry me, Dorothea Sutherland?" Dorothea stared at him, her mind reeling. A proposal. He was proposing, after 3 days. In the aftermath of scandal and forged letters and public declarations, it was madness. It was impossible. It was everything she had never dared to dream might happen. "You are proposing because of what happened tonight," she said, grasping for reason in the swirl of emotion. "Because you feel responsible for the attack on my reputation. Because you believe you owe me protection." "I am proposing," Julian corrected gently, "because what happened tonight made me realize I do not want to waste time on cautious courtship when I am already certain. I am proposing because the thought of returning you to your father's house and resuming our careful tea visits seems suddenly absurd when what I want is to know that you will be beside me permanently. I am proposing because life is short and uncertain, and I have already wasted 4 years being careful and closed. I do not want to waste another day." "We barely know each other," Dorothea protested weakly. "We know the important things," Julian replied. "We know that we value the same qualities. We know that we can talk for hours without boredom. We know that you saved my life, and I want to spend the rest of mine proving myself worthy of that gift. What more do we need to know that cannot be learned in marriage?" "Julian." His name felt strange and wonderful on her lips. "I am 29 years old. I have no fortune, no connections, no beauty to recommend me. You could choose a lady with a far more advantageous position and fortune." "Better?" His laugh was short and sharp. "I tried better. Better was Lady Vivian with her perfect beauty and perfect accomplishments and perfect plans to murder me. I do not want better by society's measures, Dorothea. I want real. I want honest. I want you." Tears spilled down Dorothea's cheeks, hot against the cold skin. All her life, she had believed herself inadequate, had accepted that she would never be chosen, would never be valued for exactly what she was. And now this man, this reserved and careful Marquess, was holding her hands in the darkness of a carriage and asking her to marry him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." The relief and profound satisfaction that transformed Julian's severe features was a sight she would treasure above any diamond. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that suggested he had no intention of ever letting her go. His lips found hers in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, a declaration, a binding promise offered and accepted in the dark. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I will obtain a special license," he said. "We can be married within days. I have no wish to subject you to months of society scrutiny while wearing my ring, but not my name." "Days?" Dorothea laughed, the sound verging on hysteria. "Julian, my father will require some time to adjust to this development. He barely knows you exist." "Then I will call upon him first thing tomorrow morning," Julian replied with the decisiveness of a man accustomed to making plans and executing them. "I will formally request your hand. We will make this as proper as possible under the circumstances, but I warn you, I am not a patient man when I have finally decided what I want." The carriage drew to a stop outside the Sutherland townhouse. Julian helped Dorothea down, then walked her to the door, propriety returning now that they were in public view again. "Tomorrow morning," he reminded her, "I will speak with your father. And Dorothea, thank you." "For what?" "For whispering that warning 3 nights ago, for saving my life, for agreeing to spend yours with me, For being exactly who you are, even when society told you it was wrong to be that person. He lifted her gloved hand to his lips, kissed it gently, and then was gone, climbing back into his carriage and disappearing into the snowy night. Dorothea stood on the steps of her father's house, watching until the carriage vanished from sight. Then she went inside, her heart so full of joy and wonder and disbelief that she thought it might burst. She had gone to a ball 3 nights ago, expecting nothing. She concluded this night betrothed to a Marquess who valued her not in spite of her peculiarities, but because of them. Life, she decided, was full of the most astonishing surprises. The following morning brought the promised call from Julian, who arrived at precisely 9 o'clock with a formality and determination that would have been amusing under other circumstances. Dorothea's father, summoned from his breakfast, listened with increasing bewilderment as the Marquess formally requested permission to marry his daughter. "But you barely know her," the Viscount protested weakly. "You have called 3 times, 4 if we count this morning. Surely some extended courtship would be more appropriate?" "With respect, my lord," Julian replied, "I know everything I need to know about your daughter's character. She is intelligent, courageous, and possessed of an integrity I have rarely encountered. Those are not qualities that require extended observation to identify. I realize the speed of this courtship is unconventional, but I am 38 years old. I know my own mind. I wish to marry your daughter as soon as arrangements can be made." The Viscount looked to Dorothea, who had been sitting silently throughout this exchange. "Dorothea, is this truly what you want? You are under no obligation to accept simply because the Marquess has defended your reputation." "It is what I want, Papa," Dorothea said clearly. "I know it seems sudden, but I believe Lord Denmore and I are well suited. I wish to marry him." What else could her father do but consent? By noon, Julian had obtained a special license. By afternoon, word had spread through London that the Marquess of Denmore was to marry Miss Dorothea Sutherland within the week. The gossip that followed was predictable and often vicious, but Dorothea found that she cared very little what people said. The wedding took place 5 days later in the private chapel at Denmore Park, Julian's estate in Wiltshire. A snowstorm on the day of the ceremony ensured that only family and a few close friends could attend, which suited both bride and groom perfectly. They had no wish for a grand society spectacle. Dorothea wore a simple gown of cream silk, no veil, no elaborate decorations. Julian waited at the altar in dark blue superfine, his gray eyes fixed on her face as she walked down the short aisle on her father's arm. The ceremony was brief, the vows spoken clearly and firmly by both parties. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her with a tenderness that made Dorothea's eyes sting with tears. Afterward, there was a quiet wedding breakfast in the great hall of Denmore Park. Lady Agatha Hartwell, one of the few guests, pulled Dorothea aside at one point. "I am glad you had the courage to accept," she said warmly. "Julian needed someone exactly like you, someone who could see past his walls to the good man beneath. I believe you will be very happy together." "I hope so," Dorothea replied honestly, "though I still sometimes wonder if I am dreaming." "You are not dreaming," Lady Agatha assured her. "You are simply discovering that sometimes courage is rewarded in the most unexpected ways." That night, as snow continued to fall beyond the windows of the Marchioness's chambers, Julian held Dorothea close and spoke words she would remember for the rest of her life. "I spent 4 wretched years believing I would never again possess the capacity for trust," he said quietly. "Believing that the world was full of deception and that the only safe course was to remain closed and careful. You proved me wrong. You showed me that there are still people of genuine character in this world, people worth trusting, worth loving, worth building a life with." "I only did what was right," Dorothea replied, her head resting on his shoulder. "No," Julian corrected gently. You did what required courage. There is a difference. And because of that courage, because you could not remain silent in the face of injustice, we are here now. Two solitary people who, but for a moment of chance and courage, would have remained strangers forever. Dorothea thought about that, about the chain of small decisions and acts of courage that had led to this moment. She thought about how close she had come to remaining silent, to convincing herself that warning him was not her responsibility. "I am glad I whispered," she said softly. "Even knowing all the chaos it would cause, I would do it again." "So would I," Julian replied, pulling her closer. "I would hear those words again. I would believe you again. I would choose you again, every time." The years that followed proved the wisdom of that hasty marriage. Julian and Dorothea built a life based on the same honesty and trust that had brought them together. They faced society's gossip with united dignity, gradually winning over even the most skeptical observers through the obvious strength of their partnership. Lady Vivian Dalton, unable to salvage her reputation, eventually married a minor Scottish laird and retreated permanently from the London world she had hoped to dominate. Lord Simon Carrick fled to India to escape his creditors and was never heard from again. Arabella Whitley, who had forged the letter at her cousin's instruction, was eventually exposed when the forger she had hired confessed under pressure from other debts. She made a tearful apology to Dorothea years later, which was accepted with characteristic grace. But those were minor notes in a larger story. The real story was of two people who had been brought together by a moment of desperate courage and had chosen to build something lasting from that foundation. 6 years after their wedding, on Christmas Eve, Dorothea stood in the same great hall where they had held their wedding breakfast, watching as their 3 children played with wooden toys before the enormous fireplace. Eleanor, the eldest at 5, was dark-haired and solemn like her father. William, 3, had his mother's sharp eyes and tendency to notice everything. Baby Margaret, just 1 year old, was currently being held by her father as he pointed out the decorations on the enormous Christmas tree. Julian caught Dorothea's eye across the room and smiled, the warm, open smile that he showed only to her and their children. She smiled back, her heart full of a contentment she had never imagined possible in those dark days when she had believed herself destined for spinsterhood. Later, when the children had been put to bed and she and Julian sat together in their private sitting room, warm fire crackling in the grate, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked Julian. "The ball where everything changed?" "Often," he admitted, his arm around her shoulders. "I think about how close I came to missing you entirely. If you had not been near that corridor, if you had not overheard, if you had not possessed the courage to speak up. I think about how close I came to remaining silent," Dorothea confessed. "How I almost convinced myself it was not my concern, that no one would believe me anyway. My entire life, people had told me that my inability to stay quiet in the face of injustice was a flaw, that I needed to learn to mind my own business, to not notice things I should ignore. That night, I realized that what they called a flaw was actually my greatest strength." "It is your greatest strength," Julian agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That inability to remain silent, that compulsion to do what is right even when it is difficult. That is what saved my life. That is what brought us together. That is what I have come to love most about you." Dorothea turned in his arms to look at him directly. "Do you truly not regret the scandal, the gossip, the way we shocked society with our hasty marriage?" "Not for a single moment," Julian said firmly. "I regret the 4 years I wasted being careful and closed. I regret that I almost married a woman who would have destroyed me. But I do not regret anything that happened after you whispered those words. I do not regret believing you. I do not regret defending you. I do not regret marrying you 5 days later. Those were the best decisions of my life." Outside, snow began to fall again, as it had on that fateful night 6 years earlier, Dorothea watched it through the window, remembering the fear and courage it had taken to approach a powerful man and whisper a warning that could have been dismissed or ignored. She had been nobody then, invisible and insignificant by society's measure. But she had seen something that needed to be said, and she had found the courage to say it, consequences be damned. That single act of courage had transformed everything. It had saved a life. It had exposed a conspiracy. It had irrevocably linked two souls who had previously stood in isolation and given them a future neither had dared to imagine. As Christmas bells began to ring in the village below the estate, announcing the arrival of the holy day, Dorothea leaned into Julian's embrace and felt a profound gratitude for the peculiar character trait that everyone else had considered a flaw. Her inability to remain silent in the face of injustice had been called many things over the years: a fault, a failing, an unfortunate tendency that would ensure her spinsterhood. But in the end, it had been exactly what saved the man she would love for the rest of her life. Sometimes, she reflected, the qualities that make you different from everyone else are precisely the qualities that make you exactly right for one particular person. Sometimes speaking truth in darkness, even when your voice trembles, is the bravest and most important thing you can do. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, a whispered warning in a crowded ballroom changes everything. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story of courage rewarded and love found in unexpected places touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, hope, and the transformative power of speaking truth when silence would be easier. Until our next tale, may you find the courage to whisper your own truths when they matter most.